there's a course today on Marxist economics, and so this is the first one talking about profit and exploitation. And in what I'm going to say, I'm wanting to talk about why exploitation is something that's fundamental to capitalism, why it's the thing that's necessary for capitalism to get. It's a process by which profits are made from the work that we do. So I think the place to sort of start off is by talking about commodities. Because all around us we have things like commodities. So we buy and sell goods. And so we have things like cars, books, coffee, socks. They're all different kinds of things. And I think because of everything in the world that we produce to buy and sell, our commodities, we need to understand them. And I think we can see them in there's two ways of understanding commodities, both in terms of use value and exchange value. So use value is the utility of a thing. It's independent of the amount of labour required to produce it, and it has no existence apart from that. So we can imagine something that's really useful, like air, but it doesn't have a very high exchange value. Or something that might have a very high exchange value, like a painting or something, but the utility of that is, well, apart from sort of enjoyment of paintings, is sort of the use of that is very specific to that. And I think we can see that, so if you have a cup of coffee and a pair of socks, their use value is very different. A pair of socks you want to keep your feet warm, a cup of coffee you might want to have a drink, or to like make you be awake and to be able to function early on a Sunday morning. However, you could imagine that a pair of socks and a cup of coffee might have the same exchange value. You might be able to get a cup of coffee for £3 or a pair of socks for £3. And so what we need to understand is how do they have the same exchange value. And I think also, so I'm just going to slightly deviate for a moment to talk about money. Because I think we can imagine, we can't go into a shop and sort of say like, okay, here's my pair of socks, I'd like a cup of coffee. We can think of things in different equivalents to each other, so we can imagine like a car could be worth 1,000 pairs of socks or something. But that's what societies tend to do is come up with a universal equivalent. So it might in some point, so something that we can exchange for, if I have a pair of socks, I want a cup of coffee, but somebody else has a chicken who wants a pair of socks, I could give them my pair of socks, get the chicken, and then go and exchange the chicken for a cup of coffee. However, chickens are not the best, the most transportable things to carry around. Probably wouldn't really want one in your bag. And I think, so what we sort of see is that we monetize things in terms of, we want to have something that's got a really high exchange value, that's quite transportable. So things like gold and silver have a very high exchange value, lots of labour has gone into them. And to produce them, so we can sort of transport things like that around. And I think money, or a universal equivalent, is an important way of which we can compare equally different products. But actually, the key thing is, what do they have in common? What means that a cup of coffee and a pair of socks has an exchange value? And I think what's really the crucial thing here is we have to be able to express them in something that's in terms common to both of them. And like, a cup of coffee isn't the same shape or size as a pair of socks, it's not made out of the same materials. But what they all have in common is that they're products of human labour. And so we can see that commodities get their value because of the work that's done by workers, by the labour that's gone into them. So it's not because of the sort of genius of entrepreneurs or machinery, it's because of the human labour that's gone into them. And we can measure human labour in terms of duration. However, I think there's an important thing here is to sort of think about is about the sort of thinking about things in the sort of socially necessary labour time. So I've knit this sock. It took me 9 months. I didn't obviously work on it continuously for 9 months, but this doesn't mean because I spent a lot of time on this sock that this is a hugely valuable sock, because actually the socially necessary labour time to make a sock is far less than 9 months. So this sock, which I bought from a shop, probably could have been produced in sort of a matter of minutes. I'm going to use socks as a sort of example throughout this, but obviously not by sort of pretending that they take a lot longer than they do, because it makes the sort of numbers easier to talk about. And so what Marx says about this is that the labour time socially necessary is that required to produce an article under normal conditions of production with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at the time. So not everybody you don't have to knit socks. We have machines that can do it sort of quickly. So it means that, say, when capitalism was first developing, when you get the sort of huge factories that can make, say, lots and lots of cloth really quickly, and sort of the labour time to produce, say, a pound of cloth is a lot less, would be a lot less than sort of somebody using a hand loom to do it. It doesn't mean that the person using a hand loom to make the cloth is producing something that's much more valuable, because that's not the socially necessary labour time at that time with the average degree of skill and intensity that's prevalent. So we have some socks. There's 3 hours worth of labour gone into them. That's the value of the socks. I think, just sort of on that, values are like an objective thing. They're proportional to the social labour that's embodied in them. It's not something that we can sort of think about in a subjective way. And it's also important to sort of note briefly that values can change. So the use value, if the pair of socks gets a hole in it, the utility of it might change because it stops being useful as a sock. But the exchange values can also change. So through technological advance, we might have the degree of the amount of labour that's required to go into them might decrease. So like the example with, say, if you can produce, say, a sock in 10 minutes on a sock machine, that means that the exchange value, because the amount of labour that's going into it, is a lot less. And what capitalism does is it draws together socially necessary labour together at different plate points and produces commodities that can be exchanged on the basis of the labour that's gone into them. So socks with 3 hours of labour. We can divide this into dead labour. So that's the labour expended in the past, which is crystallised in the means of production. And that neither makes profit, it doesn't make profit, it just sort of stays as it is. The living labour is the labour that's put directly into it by workers adding a value to a commodity. So in this pair of socks, you can imagine there's 1 hour of living labour gone into it and 2 hours of dead labour. And the value of the socks is 3 hours, which is equivalent to the living plus the dead labour.
Sorry, can you define what dead labour is? I can understand the 1 hour of knitting, but...
Okay, so dead labour, so say you've got sort of yarn that you're using to make a sock, or machinery. Some human labour has had to go into that in the past. Like, we don't just get sort of fully made yarn falling from the sky. So that has some labour in, which I'm going to sort of go on to later, talking about forms of capital, and hopefully it will be a bit clearer later.
Thank you.
So it's the labour that's expended in the past. So it's something that's, you might, if you're a capitalist, you might buy sort of a machine. That has a value because the labour that's been used to produce a machine on it. But in terms of making the socks, that just sort of stays as it is. It doesn't change. It doesn't add anything to the value of the socks. And I think under capitalism, what the key thing is who controls this means of production. So like the crystallised dead labour. So this is things like land, tools, materials for production. And under capitalism, they're private property of people. And therefore, because under capitalism, there's a separation between those who own the means of production and those who have to sell their labour power to be able to use them. The question of who controls the labour of others is important. And I think under capitalism, we're free in two senses. We're free in the sense of we don't own the means of production, and we're sort of free in the sense that there's no coercion involved to do labour. We agree a wage with our employers and things like that. But the thing is, the only thing that we have to sell is our labour power. And while we don't have to work for a particular individual capitalist, if we want to have things that we want to survive, like food, housing, clothes, or whatever, we need to sell we need to work for somebody. And so we see under capitalism that labour power becomes a commodity. So a woman working in a sock factory, she has to work to get the things that's needed to reproduce her labour power. So things like food, housing, and things like that. And what we do is we sell our ability to work for, we sell our labour power. That is like, we say like, okay, I'm going to work for you for 8 hours in a day. But the value of the labour power, so labour power being a commodity, depends on the amount of labour needed to produce it. So that is, for a worker, the things that's needed to, so like food, clothing, education, and the wage that's the sort of social labour that's needed to reproduce the sort of worker for the next day and to continue working. Also within that, there is the sort of need to produce the next generation of workers. So part of the sort of the value of the labour power that we sell depends on like being able to produce the next generation of workers. However, the amount of labour that we can perform generally is greater than the amount of labour that's needed to replenish it. So this creates some extra labour for the employee. So it might take, the value of the woman's labour power might be 4 hours, so that 4 hours value is what's needed to reproduce her labour power. But she might work for 8 hours. And the value created by her labour is 8 hours of labour. And this is where the concept of surplus value, which is really important, comes in. So that's the difference between the value created by workers and the value of the labour power that is bought. So in this case, the value created is 8 hours. The value of the labour power is 4 hours. So there's 4 hours of surplus value that's gone in.
How do you get from the 8 hours to 4 hours? Like, so she worked for 4 hours, but value is 8 hours.
No, so she works for 8 hours.
But the value is 4 hours.
The value of her labour power, so that's the thing that she's selling, is 4 hours. So there's 4 hours of value that's needed to. Because we have sort of social production in terms of like, I'm not gonna like make everything that I need by myself for the day. That we have sort of things that we have to like. We work, we get a wage, and then we have to go and buy things like food and things. The value that we need, that's necessary to produce all of those things that where we need to survive, is 4 hours, say, for a day. But you work for 8 hours. So 4 hours of what you're doing working is spent producing value equivalent to what's needed for you to have to survive. But then there's another 4 hours of work that you do that's producing value that goes to your bosses. So this is the thing of surplus value.
Could we just keep the rest of the questions until the end as well and let the speaker finish this?
And so the surplus value goes into profits, rent, and interest. So because you might, the boss might have to like rent out a factory or rent out land for somebody else, but I'm just going to generally call everything that's sort of surplus value as profits for the rest of this. And so the source of these profits is always the extra work, the sort of surplus value, the extra work that's done in a day by a worker. So this is where we have the exploitation of those who own the means of production, of people that have had to sell their labour power to produce a surplus value. And so if we look at the example of socks again, there's a 2 hours of dead labour, but we can divide the living labour into 30 minutes of wage and 30 minutes of surplus value. So half of the living labour that's gone into producing a pair of socks, half of it's gone into the wage for the worker, and 30 minutes is going to the employer. And so I want to talk a bit about capital, because I think that's the value that capitalists put forward to gain surplus value. So this can be divided into constant capital, which is things that of the value that's advanced to produce things like the plant equipment, raw materials and things, and that doesn't undergo any change in the production process. We also have variable capital, which is the capital that's advanced to purchase labour power. So that's what goes into people's wages, and that produces, the sort of variable capital produces equivalent to its own value plus the surplus value that is extracted. So if we sort of equivalent one hour of labour to £1, we have £2 of constant capital advanced in dead, that's sort of the dead capital. We have 50p as variable capital in wages, and we get the capitalist gains 50p of surplus value. So another way to think about that is that in a day, there might be 16 hours of dead labour, so in things like the machinery or the yarn that's used in the socks. There's 8 hours of living labour, and 24 hours. The value of the output from the whole day is 24 hours labour. But if we think about that in terms of capital, there's 16 hours of constant capital, 4 hours of variable capital, plus an extra 4 hours of surplus value that's created. And so if you think about that in money, the capitalist might advance £20 of capital, but at the end of the day, the value of their output is £24. So they've made £4 of profit from the surplus value that the labour of the workers has added to the capital that they've put forward. And I suppose the sort of key thing for capitalists is how do you increase the surplus value? And you need to do that. You need to raise the ratio of surplus value to wages. So there's two ways of doing this. One is by increasing the absolute surplus value. So you can do this by lengthening the working day. So the value of the labour power that the woman has still is 4 hours, but she works for 10 hours, and so the value created by her labour is 10 hours. So that we can see that in this case that there's 6 hours of surplus value. And this was a common practice in early capitalism, by sort of making people work longer and longer and longer days. However, it can be counterproductive because obviously you don't want your workers to die. You want them to sort of be able to be there for the next day, and it means that the productivity can also decrease if you're working too long and you're sort of doing things like that. So I think that what we see is that the capitalists end up giving into working class pressure to shorten the working day. So the other way that capitalists can increase the ratio of surplus value to wages is by increasing the relative surplus value. So this is where you still would work 8 hours a day, but the value of the labour power that women's putting in is only 2 hours, for instance. So this you could achieve by increasing, meaning that the value of the goods that's necessary to reproduce her labour power decreases. So the cost of paying for the labour power falls, and so you get more surplus value. Another way you could do this is by new machinery, which increases productivity. So that decreases the time that's needed for the workers to cover their wages. So it might only take her 2 hours to produce the value that's necessary to cover her wages. And this works quite well for the sort of first capitalist that tries to do this. But then if everybody has sort of the new machines that make you be able to sort of produce things more to increase productivity, it decreases the socially necessary labour time and therefore decreases the value. Sorry, that's just that. But I think, so the only way that capitalists can get profits is from the surplus value that they extract from workers. And I think that is what we mean by exploitation. I think what we have to understand is that exploitation isn't something where it means that sort of there's really horrible conditions for somebody, it means that it's something that capitalism is fundamentally based on. It's not something, it's a universal condition that actually we can unite workers on. And I think that we can see that without exploitation, there'd be no profits. But that also means if we want to end exploitation, we need to end the system which relies on, for which profit is the motive, and which relies on exploitation. And that means that we have to end capitalism.